Welcome, Will. Great to have you with us.
Really good to see you again, Jason.
I should say Professor Will Foster, not doctor. And for those people in America where everyone seems to be a professor, what does a professor actually mean in the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK, usually you get your PhD or a other professional doctorate, and that makes you a doctor. And then a university will sort of promote you to professor, and that goes through. Basically, you have to go through a selection and promotion process. So you have to have enough evidence against the criteria that the university will set.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of criteria, and if you feel that you've got enough of that criteria, you can apply. And a big panel of other professors, and usually the vice chancellor and other seniors, like the pro vice chancellor for research, will sort of debate whether you have got that standing. They'll also go externally to
yeah,
check that you have got that. So usually, as a professor, you need to be well known in your field,
yeah,
both in the country that you are and globally as well. So yeah, it's quite a rigorous process.
yeah. Yeah, so that means you're not just in terms of a PhD in an issue related to leadership as a professor of leadership. That means you've earned your chops out in the world, teaching, researching, training, writing, speaking. Yeah.
All of those things, yeah. And I think when I got my chair, so they sort of call it a
Yeah.
chair, it was the founding chair of leadership at Keele. So that was really nice that
Right.
Keele hadn't had a professor of leadership before.
Yeah.
The other thing that was really good
Yeah.
from my point of view was that I've always been a great sort of advocate of applied leadership,
Yeah.
and lots of professorial sort of research is theoretical. Mine was sort of granted for or awarded for that sort of applied. So
Wonderful.
not just my own scholarship, but also
Yeah.
my strategic leadership as well. So that was really nice, because I always advocate in all of the stuff that I do. It's
Yeah.
about what impact is this going to make, what
Great.
effect is this going to have, how is this going to help people
Yeah.
in their practice of leadership.
Fantastic. So now, Professor, we're going to test you. No, we're not.
Absolutely.
We're going to have a good conversation
I think
about leadership.
Keith Grint once said that sort of when he was a leader, he thought he knew everything there was to know about leadership. And then when he started to learn about leadership, I mean, he's a professor as well of leadership,
Yeah.
and it just shows how much you don't know. So I think a professor is someone who realizes quite how much they don't know about the field that they're an expert in.
Even more. I forget who said it. It's a quote I love: "As the island of our knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance."
Love it.
I'm post PhD, and I probably read more since doing my PhD than on my PhD, and I feel like, do I know anything? I want to give up some days, don't you? It's like I don't feel I know anything. Well, now we're going to have a chat then. So around leadership. So a few months ago, we had a great round table with a bunch of us, another professor, and some other doctors of leadership from different disciplines in leadership. Been interviewing them, and people can catch those up here on the site. And we're going to pick up the same with you, Will. So the premise for today is this issue of a leadership crisis that we're in and the perma crisis that we're in, but to lead into your perspective on it and your understanding of it. So my first question really is, let's just start right from the beginning. How do you see the current leadership crisis? You know, if I was going to say someone walked up to you in the pub and said, "Hey, professor, what's going on with this leadership crisis?" But that probably wouldn't happen. But if they were a leadership student who walked up to you in the pub and said, "What's this leadership crisis all about?" What would you say?
I think my starting point would be to recognise the sort of context that leadership operates in. So I think there's a couple of things about leadership. One is that our understanding of what leadership is shaped massively by the social and cultural context that we're in.
Yeah.
And then our execution or our practice of leadership is again shaped by the context that we're in. So the two contexts um, that I sort of have quite a bit of experience in. One is the higher education or academic context. So I've been in academia for 20 years in strategic leadership roles. So that's the one context. The other context is church and sort of pastoral and ecclesiology. So they're the two areas, and they sort of meet in the charitable sector as well. About 15 years of charity, been on boards of directors. So there's some of the perspectives that I think about. And I think if we take each of those sort of perspectives, if you take higher education as a starting point, I moved from the commercial sector into higher education in 2005. And at the time, I'd been working in consultancy, and we'd done a lot of work in the automotive industry. And in the UK, for those who are not in the UK, our automotive industry went through quite a significant change and turmoil when the government changed its approach to funding. And we had inward investment from Japanese companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. And our sort of British Leyland that became Rover Group was really struggling to compete because quality wasn't great, reliability wasn't good, cost wasn't great. And these Japanese companies came in with just in time, high levels of quality, quality circles, TQM, that sort of thinking. And it created quite a bit of change and turmoil for our motor industry. And when I joined the higher education sector in 2005, I remember in my interview sort of indicating that that sort of change was probably on the cards for higher education. And with in the UK, the increased student fees, with the way that higher education seen politically, what we've experienced over the past 2 decades is quite seismic change. Add into that COVID and the pandemic,
Yeah.
and globalization and lots of these other factors, we're now in a much more volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, sort of complex context than we were 20 years ago. The challenge that's happened in this particular context is that when I started in the sector, one of the things that really shocked me was that I was a associate dean and head of school, and I had principal lecturers reporting to me who were earning the same salary that the general manager of my business unit at Rolls-Royce had earned. And so these were, in salary terms, really senior people. Yet, in leadership terms, they never had really any leadership development. They saw themselves as senior academics with a little bit of admin. Yet they were leading and managing teams of up to 30, 40, 50 people. And I think when you've got a stable organisational and sector context, the demands on leadership are very different to when all of a sudden your organisation needs to be more responsive. OFS, the Office for Students, sort of regulation changes, things like the Teaching Excellence Framework and the Research Excellence Framework. All of a sudden, those and the league tables become ultra important. And so the demands on leadership, when finances are then stretched and universities are downsizing and making people redundant and reducing the size of their financial bill, yet trying to recruit more students. So there's lots of different pressures that come from that. And that's where I think that sort of perfect storm of crisis. And you could translate that into a church context as well if you wanted to.
Yeah. So increasing complexity, squeezing on resources, marketization, and trying to hit a moving target with your eyes closed and blindfolded. Yeah.
All in the context of, absolutely, all in the context of not having a strategic or structured way of forming leaders. So I've sort of started using this word leadership formation as opposed to leadership
Right.
development or training.
Ah.
And that sort of links with, if we talk about the church context, that sort of sense of spiritual formation as in contrast to discipleship.
Yeah.
So again, some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of church leadership, some of the challenges have been that certainly in the evangelical Pentecostal sort of context, a lot of our training or development of disciples has been through programs, discipleship programs.
Yeah.
Our leaders really, even going back 10, 15 years, and possibly in some denominations even now, the main sort of worldview of, in order to be a great pastor, you need to know your Bible, you need to know Greek, you need to know Hebrew. That was dominant in our sort of denominations 10, 15 years ago. And the actual training of leadership
Yeah.
skills and formation was quite limited. And so those two things in parallel, not really paying attention to spiritual formation of the person
Yeah.
and thinking that just sort of programs will do the job,
Yeah.
and that sense of not really thinking about leadership formation. I
Yeah.
think they're some
Yeah.
of the perfect storm that
Yeah.
creates the challenges that we've seen in the Christian context.
Yeah. Since I love that phrase, leadership formation. Listening to you, it jogs in my memory a conversation with someone who I know has been in pastoral ministry for 50 years. And I said, look, what changes have you seen? And he gave me a high level summary. He said, look, when he started, he said people's things were more stable, lives were more stable. There were pastoral problems and divorces and serious illness, but people got involved and people participated and people gave and you looked after people. And there was, and he didn't say this, but I got the sense there was room for formation, if we use that phrase. But now we know we need formation more than ever. But in every leadership environment, there's no time for deep work or formation because we're all trying to produce more with less for greater demands and bureaucracy and marketization, and the very thing that we need is the very thing that, is we can't do. So how do we,
I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I think there are some principles, and I think some of the grounding of my sort of thinking and the way that I've been thinking about this was sort of catalyzed a little bit in about 2005 as I started, sorry, 2015,
Mm.
as I started processing some of the leadership sort of challenges and crises that I'd personally been involved in our church context, and sort of some of the trauma that created for the church, for others, and myself. And I think the sorts of ideas and principles in something like Pete Scazzaro's emotionally healthy church, emotionally healthy leadership, emotionally healthy spirituality. I think sort of the Dallas Willard sense of how are you measuring success?
Yeah.
Because as long as your success is sort of linked to how many people in your congregation, how many tithes are coming in, what your size of your building or the biggest building project. And these were big measures of success when I first became a Christian in 2001, have been for my particular denomination. I think those work against some of the more slowed down spirituality that time. So I think part of it is that. I think part of it is around also that sense of soul keeping as well.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that sort of John Mark Comer has been developing these resources, free resources for church
Mm.
through the organisation he set up, Practicing the Way. And we are a pilot church that's in the circle for looking at the resources and testing them out. And they've been brilliant at, teaching on things like silence and solitude and Sabbath and fasting and generosity in a way that brings, I would say, a more contemplative sort of foundation into a more contemporary setting. And that's
Yeah.
sort of people like John Mark Cromer, John Ortberg, Dallas Willard,
Mm.
Ruth Haley Barton. They've sort of been speaking and writing on this sort of thing. But I think the other thing that has really been a foundational influence for me is Janet Hagberry and Robert Gulick's book, The Critical Journey, that takes a stage theory approach to faith. And so they outline 6 stages of faith and also the wall. And what struck me as I started to get into this was that most of the experience I've had in church contexts is that we only recognize the first 3 stages of faith, which is recognition of God. We recognize the need for God, and then discipleship, learning about God, and then the productive life, actually serving and making a difference. And when we only see those 3 as the main sort of ways of being Christian,
Yeah.
we miss the other 3. And the next one, the stage 4, is the inner journey. And that's usually either you'll hit the wall and go into the inner journey, or you'll hit the wall as part of that inner journey.
Mm.
And a lot of the times when I've seen people entering that sort of, actually the old ways are not working anymore, the productive life has just sort of I burnt out, I'm worn out. I've
Yeah.
got doubts about what faith is now. In the leadership context
Yeah.
historically that I've been in, that's seen as a problem and a problem to solve. And so either the individual or the leader will try to get that person back into stage two discipleship or back into stage three productive life. And what we haven't historically done, and what I've been
Mm.
sort of writing about and speaking at conferences about for the past sort of 3 or 4 years, has been that sense of recognizing that that inner journey is an invitation from God to learn or to be invited into deeper ways of connecting with him. And I've likened it before to a little bit like, when my daughters were learning to ride a bike
Mm.
and
Yeah.
eventually we have to take the stabilizers off and I have to stop holding the saddle. And I feel that, there's that sense that God hides himself for us, not from us, but it can feel, dark night of the soul, St. John of the Cross.
Mm.
It can feel quite
Yeah.
desolate. You can feel, if you haven't got the right support and the right sort of frameworks for it, you can feel as though there's something drastically wrong. And what I've found is, so for the last couple of years, I've been delivering modules at master's level. So these are generally mature leaders who are studying theology, and have taken a leadership module. And I've sort of introduced them to these sorts of ideas and this sort of vocabulary. And there are tears, and you can just see the way that people are impacted
Yeah.
by the fact that, oh, my life, I thought there was something wrong with me, but you have given me a vocabulary, or this gives me a vocabulary and a framework to understand what I've been through or what I've been going through. And actually, I'm, I'm not crazy. It is part of that natural life. And I think sort of our historic denominations in Anglicanism's Catholicism, that those who are more connected to that sort of rooted early Christianity are, are a little bit more tuned into this. I think for Pentecostals in the UK, where we were really thrown out of those denominations, there's been a bit of a disconnect.
Mm.
What Simon Chan says in his book, A Pentecostal Traditioning, we need to tradition ourselves. We need to reconnect into some of these ancient pathways. Jeremiah 6:16, stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the good ways of walking, ask for the ancient paths, and you will find rest for your soul. So I think that rest for your soul, which is where we started this rather longer bit,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
is we do need to be able to prioritize the space for leaders to be able to not be stuck in that productivity activity stage three.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, gosh, so much there. You remind me of, I did some doctoral work 20 years ago on using James Fowler for faith stage stuff and looked at something similar. And, certain kinds of churches have a spirituality of, like you said, it's, there's something wrong with you. You need to believe more, work harder, and notice that what often happens is people burn out, break down. That's how they break through. Well, sometimes they never get back, or they find routes into a more participatory, you've mentioned Catholics and more traditional churches that have a spirituality of participation in suffering and that being normal. And for a maturing of faith that was there, you took it the dark night of the soul, John of the Cross and others, and we desperately need that in our spirituality. I've noticed, I know you and I have talked as well as in the round table about, people tend to go off, them now it's okay. You might go off to a therapist, but it's still over there. You go off to a coach over there and come back. But how's that get integrated into a spirituality of leadership, of processing growth information? Once I was thought like a child, but now I don't. And how do I grow? And we can't really. And I hear you. There's this topic of formation and deep formation that we need to survive in the long run and thrive, let alone become better leaders in the context we're in. It also reminds me of, Simon Walker, similar conversation with Simon Walker. One of the things I've noticed in his Undefended Leader about power, how we bear power, what it does to us. One of the ways we deal with that is we opt out of it and just go, I've got friends who've done that. You just make cups of tea for people and look after them pastorally because that's, that opts you out of a power structure and it's a good way to do. Or how do we handle power? Because we need to be able to handle power, and we need to be formed for our souls to be well and healthy. And, and the answer is not in the current leadership crisis. One of the things we see is this: you can risk manage everything to death, which, the Edwin Freeman was warning us about this decades ago in Failure of Nerve, another risk assessment, and it'll all be safe. We should be taking risks as Christian leaders in handling power better and being deeply connected to Jesus. Yeah, you're nodding away. What are you nodding to?
I am, and I'm writing a few things down. Otherwise, I'll forget to talk about them. I think that sense of power is really, really important, and I think we don't talk about power enough, and we don't always have the language, the vocabulary, and the framework to really understand power. And I know that Simon Weston, that you've sort of had Simon as well, and sort of his sort of brilliant book, Leadership: A Critical Text, is fantastic. But my understanding is that was based on his PhD, that he studied the Quakers and he wanted to understand what happens in a leaderless type situation. Well, it's not leaderless. What happens is power goes underground.
Yeah.
Power is still exercised. It's just not overt. And when power isn't overt, that's when you can get some real problems. The other issue is Keith Green, who I mentioned earlier. He's written a lot on wicked problems.
Oh,
And I think this is an interesting topic. So just for those who haven't come across this, sort of it was probably, I think, in the 60s, and I think it was town planning people who worked out the fact that actually there are tame problems, there are critical problems, and there are wicked problems. And tame problems are problems basically we've seen before, ones that they might be complicated, but there's usually a solution out there. You know what the problem is, and I would give a good example of a complicated time problem might be a deputy head in a large secondary school who's got to do the timetable over summer. There's lots of staff, there's lots of different subjects, there's lots of rooms, there's lots of but there are systems and there are methods and there are processes, and it is a headache, but it can be done. Critical problems are the ones that need an urgent solution. Ones that have some degree of criticality to them. So it might be there's been a big pile up on the M6 and it's the emergency services having to go in and save lives and sort of deal with all of those complicated factors, but there's a degree of real urgency. And then there are wicked problems, and wicked problems are complex rather than complicated. And there are ten sort of tests of, is this a wicked problem? This has never really been seen before. It's got lots of interrelated sort of issues. You can never solve it. You can only try and make it better. So there's that gives it's a messy sort of problem. And the reason I mention it in terms of a leadership context is that often as leaders, we are trying to solve wicked problems in the mode as though they are tame problems or as though they are critical problems. So in critical problems, what you notice is that leadership can become a little bit more directive. It becomes more about the leader and the decision maker. In tame problems, it's a little bit more managerial. Whereas in wicked problems, what leaders really need to do in wicked problems is get different stakeholders together and set a context for them to try and help make this situation better than it is at the moment. And the difficulty is with a wicked problem, you've got financial, you've got technological, you've got social, you've got cultural, you've got political, you've got legislative, you've got all these factors. And you might make something better in one way, but it makes it worse in another.
Yeah.
And so that's why you need a more sophisticated view of leadership. But I think what we've seen through the pandemic and through some of the financial crises is that people have moved more towards that critical, directive, almost messiah hero view of leadership. And the problem with the messiah hero view of leadership, it puts leadership on one person usually, and that one person can't deal with the level of complexity. So in order to deal with it, things are simplified to the degree that you're solving a bit of the problem, but it's actually a wicked problem. So you're causing all sorts of other problems. So I think that that plays into that sort of
Yeah.
risk, because to solve a wicked problem, you've got to be able to fail forward. You've got to be, it's that sense of we need to try, because we don't know what the problem is and we won't know the solution when we've got it. We need to be able to try things and not succeed without being blamed or ridiculed. So that was one of the things that came to mind. And that also fits in this power as well. Where does power reside? Are you distributing power or are you localizing power? Is it about the leader or is it about the leadership system? And again, this is the language I've been trying to bring, that sense of if things are not quite the way they need to be, often the sort of scapegoating can be on the leader.
Yeah.
But usually there's an issue with your leadership system, your leadership approaches, your governance systems. There's usually a complex set of things going on, and just to say that leader's not doing the right job is a little bit naive.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, I mean, there's some elements there, aren't there, that, I was going to say scrabbling around, but we're learning.
Yeah,
Let's take Simon Walker's, being undefended, the ability to, I mean, that's an ego issue in our shadow side, and be willing to collaborate with other people, know that other people have answers that we don't, and live with the grey and stuff. That's important. But there's a developmental piece there, isn't there? Which I've been noticing. You really got to lean in developing people, because developing people that you're collaborating with, and then but finding ways still to lead. So let me turn that into a question. So if we can have tempered egos, be a non-anxious presence, all these other factors that we're learning, if we can collaborate with other people and empower them and stuff, what does it then, where are those moments still where the leader offers leadership other than being a facilitator who's got a great inner life? Does that question make sense?
yeah, it does.
Rubber hit the road
And
where you're responsible.
yeah, I think I would point us towards Edgar Schein's work on organizational culture and leadership.
Yeah.
And so, sort of John Maxwell, brilliant leadership writer, says, everything rises and falls on leadership. So the first premise that we work from, or there's three premises I tend to work on. That's the first one. Everything rises and falls on leadership. So investing in your leadership capital is really important. So one thing I would do is to say, how do we develop and form our leaders? That should be a priority. The second premise from Edgar Schein comes from his assertion that, the primary of occupation of a leader should be to understand and shape culture. So to understand the culture, and I think since the 80s, culture's been talked about a lot. I think in the 80s, it was very much you need a strong culture, Peters and Waterman, In Search of Excellence, all that sort of stuff. And then when a strong culture is great when things are stable, but as soon as the environment changes, strong cultures find it very difficult to change. And so that's a bit of an issue. So Ed Schein comes at culture from an anthropological rather than managerial perspective. And sort of talks about us understanding culture in the same way an anthropologist would go into a different country and understand the cultures and the practices, the norms and the rituals, So when we think about culture, he talked about the iceberg model, that we see the 20% and 80% is the thing, the sort of not the espoused values, but the lived values,
Yeah.
the hidden assumptions that everybody just does and nobody questions, that sense of culture being the water that we swim in. So there's those ideas around culture. There's Joe Martin, who talked about culture not being a homogenous single thing, but also elements of culture that are fragmented and differentiated and subcultures. And then you get sort of the Johnson and Scholes cultural web that breaks culture down into structures and rituals and stories and power structures and all those different elements. So I think as leaders, the second premise is that we should be understanding the culture that we are inhabiting, I'm talking about organizational culture here, how we are shaping the organizational culture, how we can shape it,
Mm.
and how it shapes us.
Mm.
And that moves me on to the third premise, which is about change, and that sort of Heraclitus of Ephesus, the only constant is change. But I always add to that, and the only variable is the rate of change, and it's accelerating and it's complexifying as well. And so you bring these three things into dialogue with each other. And I think the leader's role is around
Mm.
developing the leadership systems. Now that might be about, how do we think about strategy? How do we develop vision? How do we do those things that are historically seen as leadership? But how do we develop a model of leadership system that means people are engaged with that process, and it's not a done to, but it's a done with process? How are we understanding change? I don't tend to use the word, when we come to culture, I don't tend to use the word change with culture, because there is a sort of mindset this brings, which is, as the leader, I am in charge of the culture and I can change it. Now, it's true that the leader is one of the most influential parts of culture. But the reality is that culture's been formed over decades and decades and decades since that organization was formed. And in fact, some of those forming values are the things that are still most influential today, in addition to new leader thinking and organizational learning. So that sense of, so when I talk about change, I talk about understanding and leading change rather than managing change. So that sense of culture, it's how do we shape it? So yeah, there's some thoughts on, as leaders, what should our primary occupation be? It should be about how we develop the whole leadership system and how we think about that. How do we understand and intentionally shape the culture that's needed to support the organization? And how do we understand and lead
Yeah.
rather than manage change?
Yeah. Thank you. That was almost professorial.
When I went for my professorial sort of status, my boss kept saying to me, "But Will, what do you profess? A professor should profess something." And I think actually my journey since getting, I think I got my professorial status about 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And actually the last 5 or 6 years have been about finding my voice, finding that sense of what are the really important things
Mm.
that will help leaders
Yeah.
and help organizations,
Yeah.
um, in this sort of really challenging context that we find ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer to my question about what leadership is, leadership proper. And I mean, you touched on it there about change management. And I think that's in the complexity, even the best leaders leaning into it. And what I hear there is, you're like, how do I be tactical? How do I be strategic? How do I manage this? There's so many variables to have systems and processes for that we need, and they're really important. But you can get pulled into strategy and management, as important as they are. But how do we hold on to or discover what the core of leadership itself proper is that you're warning us about? And I just want to draw in here with the time that we've got at the EPTA paper. You got some really high level things as I read them. You talk about the movement from performance to presence. So one of the ways I understand that when I read that is actually in the culture and environment and the world that we're in with all the wicked problems, we're never going to find the performance, the magic bullet is, we can't measure enough things or do enough things. That's not going to bring the ordering. So we go from performance to presence. And when I hear that, presence is that's a that's a disposition, that's an orientation, that's who we are. And suddenly I think that could be incredibly freeing, that the kind of person we are lends itself, our formation as a person and presence lends itself to change. And presence implies a lot of things, but working backwards, this is what I want to ask you about. So I'll just dump them out here. You talk about going from the presence-based leadership is going from ego to echo, or eco, not echo, perfectionism to authenticity, activity to purpose. I just loved that because you got all the working out in here for that because you're a good professor. But for a lot of leaders listening to this and Christian leaders are going, how do I, what do I do? And so I'm hearing you say, hey, it's not about performance, it's about presence. And then presence is these things. So can we just work through those? Start with ego to,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can
yeah,
I just say that there's something that you said as you introduced this
yeah,
sort of idea, and it's something that really has stuck with me, which is a Dallas Willard ism, which is about who we're becoming rather than what we're doing. And that sense of, I think it's posited in the, when we get to heaven, God's going to be less interested in all of the things we did for him and who we've become for him. And I think that sense of presence works really lovely because actually, the idea of spiritual formation, the idea of our formation is to sort of allow ourselves to
Yeah.
be formed into the image of Christ. And so that has got to be about being in his presence
Mm.
and then what we're carrying as a presence.
Yeah.
But these are what we call leader shifts. So again, this is drawing
Sorry,
on
can I just
John.
hit?
Yeah,
I
go
want to
on.
respond because that was so good. I want to respond to that, and then we'll get to the if I can.
Yeah, go
Because
for it.
I've always thought, or for a long time thought, this we're human beings, not human doings, is an artificial separation. You're to be is to do. To do is to what we do shapes who we become. If I'm dead, I'm not doing very much. And if I'm busy and a workaholic, that turns me into a certain kind of being. And I think this, that we try and spin from one to the other. So, but this is so important that it's who we're becoming comes out of what we do, and what we do shapes who we become. I mean, that's deeply theological. It's like what we love is what we do, and that space and place. So drop the idea of presence in there. And we've then got these things you're about to talk about that can shape who we become, and that forms us for what we do.
And again, looping back a little bit, when we talked about the stage theory and we talked about the 6 stages of faith, one of the things that's really important to sort of recognize in this conversation is that people get stuck at different stages. So, and one of the critical stuckness in stage 3, which is the productive life, is that actually, we hail as heroes those leaders, those Christian leaders who build big churches, who have big income, who big build. We think that's success,
Yeah.
and actually they can get caught up in thinking that, and that can stop that formation. So John Maxwell talks about a leader shift. So we talk about leadership, but sort of when we sort of develop, and Carice and I have done a lot of work. I know that you've interviewed Carice,
Yeah.
you mentioned that before.
That's right.
Carice and I have been doing a lot of work in higher education with senior leaders and sort of bringing these ideas to them. But we're borrowing from John Maxwell, and he talks about this leader shift.
Leadership.
And that sense
Right.
of, let's talk about ego to eco. And we mentioned Simon
Yeah.
Weston again. Simon Weston, in his book Leadership: A Critical Text, talks about the discourses of leadership over the centuries. And he talks about the sort of the emerging context is this eco leadership. And when we talk about eco, we're not talking about the green or the climate in a leadership context. What we're talking about is that sense of ecosystems of leadership. So
Yeah.
we need to
Right.
be clear about that.
Yeah.
But that shift from
Mm.
the sort of great man theory, the hero, the messiah, the sort of the hero leader is very much that ego. It's all about the person. And then the eco is more about the system where you are as a leader
Mm.
in the system of leadership that you
Mm.
construct and shape and build around you. So that's the
Yeah.
first one. I think that sense of perfectionism as well. I think that comes from that. We talk about the two mindsets. You can either have the mindset of an expert or the mindset of an explorer.
Mm.
And I wonder whether our conversation today, I tried to almost deconstruct that sense of a professor being an expert at the start of the
Yeah.
conversation, because it allows us to explore then. So an expert, you look to, they know everything, they've got all the answers, whereas an explorer is
Mm.
sort of trying things out. They're willing to try and fail. So again, that mindset of perfectionism very much belongs to that sense of, we want everything. You talked about, we want it
Yeah.
risk assessed, we want it to go well. And I think that, when I was in industry, we had very much a cascade approach to change. So you would plan your change out, you'd have detailed plans, and successful change would be all around these detailed plans. And it would be in a waterfall way. You would do one bit, then the next bit, then the next bit. But what the agile revolution taught us is that actually, we can do things in parallel, and we can, rather than wait until we've got the perfect plan and then executing it, well, let's try some stuff and see whether it
Yeah.
works. So I think that, and that sense of,
Yeah.
I think there are some real challenges around authenticity,
Mm,
because I think people bring baggage to that word. And I think there are lots of challenges around in the workplace.
mm,
Authenticity can be linked to privilege as well. If you're not privileged, it's hard for you to be authentic. If you're part of a minority group that doesn't have a voice, it's, it's risky for you to be authentic. So
yeah.
I think when I think about authenticity, rather than think about what is authenticity, rather what we don't want to be is hypocrites. That sense of wearing, that Greek word for hypocrite is that wearing a mask, the sort of actor. And it's that sense of the person, that presence that you are
Mm,
is the is not an act. It's not sort of artificial. And obviously, in terms of there is an authentic leadership theory, and the authentic leadership theory talks about the authenticity wheel, and you can go and have a look on that. It's included in sort of theory and practice by Peter Northouse, but it's not his theory. It's I can't remember who did the original theory of that. And then that sense of activity to purpose. One of the other things I wanted to bring in at this point is the fact that since the Industrial Revolution and the scientific approach to management, which was brought in the early 1900s by Taylor and Fayol, since then, a dominant metaphor for thinking about organisations has been organisation as machine.
yeah.
Sense that if you feel like a small cog in a big wheel,
Yeah.
that's using industrial metaphors. I've heard people say we want a culture reset, as though culture is like a computer that you can do a reboot and reinstall the factory settings and it'll be okay.
Yeah.
And I think we do this very subconsciously. We think about, when you think about productivity and efficiency,
Yeah.
lots of organisations want to do that because they've got limited resources, limited finances, but they do it in a way that is quite utilitarian. And it ignores the fact that organisations are actually webs of social construct.
Yeah.
That they're people, they're teams, and we lose that humanness
Mm,
of leadership. Leadership, you become a human resource. Even that term, human resource, you are a unit of resource to be consumed by the organisation for its purposes, rather than a group of humans who are developing meaning and creating meaning from the existence that we have in that organisation. So that all sounds very ethereal, I know, but it comes into the sense
yeah.
that things have since the Industrial Revolution, we've had an information revolution,
Mm,
and now we've got a purpose revolution. If you do the research into Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and like you and I, Jace, when we were younger, the idea was that you got a job and your meaning was from doing a good job. That's not enough anymore.
mm,
People want to work for organizations that have got a real sort of mission that sort of has values the same as their values. People want to work for organizations where the purpose is something they can buy into. So the nature of leadership for people who've been brought up in a different construct, like you and I,
yeah.
we have to understand, well,
Yeah.
what is Gen Alpha? What is
Yeah.
Gen Alpha? What are they? What are their sort of values? What are their worldviews? How are they approaching things?
Thank you. I mean, you said about being ethereal. There's a lot of important conceptual things there. And it's one of the things that I think leaders need to be able to do: stand back and do that reflective work. And I think that's why those top domains, those transformations of what move from perfectionism to presence looks like, I mean, again, is so powerful and compelling. Ego to ecosystem, perfectionism to authenticity, activity to purpose, and you've explained that.
And ego. I need to say, ego isn't bad in and of itself. What Richard Raw, in his
Yeah.
book Falling Upwards: The Two Halves of Life, the drawing on Jungian psychology, says is actually you need a strong ego in the early part of your life in order to survive and to and to make your way in the world. The thing is, you come to a point in time where you've probably he talks about ego being like a big bucket.
Yeah.
So you've got a strong ego, it's the bucket, but you filled it with all the things you thought were important. And part of moving from the first half of life to the second half of life is emptying that bucket and allowing God to fill it. And that you mentioned shadow work,
Yeah.
and that's the sense of dealing with a false self so that you can allow your true self. You know, the full self is the way that your natural beauty created by God has been abused and forced into different sort of, you know, ways that are not the way that God made you to be. You've constructed walls of defense, ways of being in the world. And so I think there's something beautiful that's around how do we, in partnership with God, create a context where we can allow the Spirit to do its work on us so that we can become more of our true selves.
Wonderful. Yes, not no egos, but better egos. So I'm going to bring this into land with us with some final questions. So if I imagine I'm a Christian leader, I'm listening to you share this stuff and it's resonating. I'm like, oh, I want that. I can feel the weight of that and life, in it. And I'd like that. And I'm sitting there with my notes and I'm going, yeah, I want to move you know, from inflated egos to tempered egos to, this ecosystem of involvement and collaboration. I want to get away from productivity driven perfectionism to real vulnerability, honest vulnerability, that involves other people. I want to get away from the treadmill of activity and just doing what's urgent in front of us to meaning and purpose and mission for people. I'm thinking that's what I signed up for and that's what I want the people I'm with you, Will. So they say all of that. That's all going on in their heads, my head. So let's turn this into a question. So I like them as a leader. I like the metaphor, and it gets a lot of traction when I get to talk with other groups of leaders, not in theological settings, but mostly organizational ones. And I'm sure you've heard it, the difference between a thermometer taking the temperature and a thermostat. And I just want to frame the questions this way. I'm like, okay, so how do we take our temperature around those dynamics, our ecosystem and our authenticity and our purpose? Because we need to find ways to measure it other than going, it's all great or it's terrible. What are ways that leaders can start to measure the temperature or where those things are at? And then as a leader, how do you change the thermostat? If you go, we've got too much fragile egos and not enough purpose. Once you've taken the temperature on those, how do you change the temperature?
Okay, so the answer I'm going to get to involves some work I've been doing with Advanced HE, developing a leadership framework. So I'm going to land with that. Where I want to start, though, is that it, it is just to say that this is the journey of formation is different to the journey of information. And so that difference between as a leader, this all sounds great stuff. I think I've been on a 10-year journey. And I did experience the dark night of the soul, but I think St. John of the Cross needs putting in front of the Trades Description Act, because the dark night of the soul lasted about 3 years for me. So that sense of actually, in order to not progress, that progress is the wrong word, in order to journey through or to be invited into and to accept the invitation to that inner journey, you almost have to let go of those measurements and those other bits and all the things that you just asked me about, and be willing to allow God to lead you through this. Now, there are things that you can equip yourself with,
Yeah.
and I've mentioned a number of them as a result of this talk. So I think the first thing is, I don't think you can just go from, oh, this sounds great, let's do it. I think there has to be Ruth Haley Barton in her book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. She talks about transforming leaders. And I love that, because there's lots of leadership theory that's been focused on transformational leadership, which is about how do we transform our people and our organizations. And Dennis Turish wrote a brilliant book, The Dark Side of Transformational
Yeah.
Leadership,
Yeah.
which I'd really recommend. But Ruth Haley Barton talks about transforming leadership, and she posits it this way, which is a transforming leader is one who is being transformed and then brings their transformation into their leadership. And I think that links to what you started the this part of the conversation with that reflective work. So I think as I'm developing leaders, it's always in that experiential applied learning, but in the context of the reflective practitioner.
Yeah.
So that sense of we've got experiences and we need to reflect on those in conversation and dialogue with theory. And we need to think about how we're going to change and how we're going to experiment. And then we go and do that change. And then we reflect on again that concrete experience, that the cold learning cycle, if at its earliest. Right. I think what we have sensed in the higher education sector is that we don't have the vocabulary or the frameworks to talk constructively about leadership formation. And so for the last 2.5 years,
Mm.
my colleague Fiona Lennox-Smith and myself have been developing, in partnership with the sector, the framework for leading in higher education. Now, this is a framework that has been specifically developed to respond to the needs of the higher education sector.
Mm.
However,
Yeah.
what I would say is that leadership, 80% of leadership is it's massively dependent on context,
Yeah.
but the sorts of skills, abilities, understanding, and ways of being are sort of context neutral. So you could take this framework, and it's
Right.
freely available on the Advanced HE website. If you do a search, framework for leading in higher education, Will Foster, it should come up. If not, Jason will send you a link. Just ask it. And I think what we base this. So just a little bit of context.
Mm.
We got some external professors, Richard Bolden and Richard Watermeyer,
Mm.
to do a scoping study for us. So that there was a massive academic piece of work that scoped out. And the question we were asking is what works in leadership in higher education?
Mm.
And then there was a report. Again, that report's available. And so we got quite a firm academic foundation. But then what we did is we researched all the other leadership frameworks that were available, whether they're in different sectors like the NHS. There is equally complex and
Ah.
challenged, or whether it was professional frameworks like the Institute of Leadership and Management or the Chartered Management Institute, and other educational frameworks and frameworks from Australia and frameworks from the
Mm.
Middle East. And so we sort of pulled all this together and we looked at, well, what are the strengths of those frameworks and what are the
Yeah.
sort of where could we improve on those frameworks? And so we ended up with this, what we hope is a very contemporary, very flexible leadership framework. And at its heart, it encourages us to think about the knowledge and understanding that we need as a leader, the skills and the way those skills are applied, the applications of a leader, and the mindsets and values of a leader. That's the core. And then we think about people, practices, and places that go around that. So, how do we think about the people we're leading? How do we think the place we're leading? How do we think about our leadership practice and the leadership practices of others? And then around the edge is impact, outcomes, and strategy, vision, strategy, and culture. And then we break those down into 15 different dimensions. And so all of a sudden, if you have a look at that model,
Yeah.
you've got it doesn't tell you how to be a better leader.
Yeah.
So it talks about you need to know what competencies you need, but it's not prescriptive about those
Got it. Yeah.
competencies, because those competencies will depend on your context. But what I would say is, unless we've got a framework, so the reason a thermometer and a thermostat works is because we've got a common understanding of what temperature is. We've got ways of scaling that temperature,
Yeah.
and we've got ways of measuring it.
Yeah.
And without something like
Yeah.
the framework for leading in higher education, we're struggling, because what we haven't said in all of this is leadership is a very contested space.
Yeah.
People have got different views of leadership, whether you come at it from the social sciences or from
Yeah.
theology or from anthropology or from other, political. Each field has a different mindset, has a different worldview. And so I think you have to recognize that because of that complexity in leadership itself, we have to have a common way of talking about it. That would be one. That's only one little answer to the question. There's lots of other
But
dimensions.
it's a way. And again, we began with the leadership crisis, the busyness, the overwhelm, the need for formation and shadow side and all that kind of stuff, and having too much to deal with. And again, leaders can go, yes, I really want this, desperate for this, but where do I start without, having to become a world expert on it? The usual thing. How do I get off the hamster in the wheel? Moving too fast. I haven't got a chance to do it. Or sharpening the saw, or all the other metaphors that we all know about. So yeah, thank you. That framework, we'll grab that. So I'm
Brilliant.
hearing something there. We can share that with people. Yeah.
I think the other thing to flag is that I think all of the work I've been doing on this, the papers I've been writing, the teaching I've been doing, over the next, or so over the last few months and over the next few months,
Yeah.
I'm going to put these together in terms of some resources. So, I already teach this on master's modules, but I'm going to try and get that into a more online format, and I'm also writing I'm having a go at writing a novel called The Retreat. That's part of this, that will help people in terms of the formation side of things as well. So I'm thinking about how can I bring together all of this learning, all of the stuff that we've talked about, the conversations, the work I've been doing with Carice and with Fiona and others. How can we bring that together in terms of a set of resources that will help leaders? So yeah, that's a little bit of a side project that is going to become a main project over the next few months.
Wonderful. Wow. Well, thank you for all that. So I got my last question for you. What's the one thing leaders aren't talking about and should be, or aren't talking about enough and should be?
I mean, there are so many things that you could say on that. I think we need to pull that question back to why aren't leaders talking about some things? And the reason leaders aren't talking about some things is they haven't always got psychologically safe spaces to do so. So I think because I would always bring it back to culture, I would say, how do we create what leaders generally are not talking enough about culture in the deep sense. And within that, in order for us to be able to grow and develop and form in the way that is sort of positive and healthy, how do we create cultures that allow us to have psychologically safe spaces where we can be authentic, not a veneer of what appears to be authenticity but isn't, that allows us to fall apart if we need to fall apart, or to do that sort of work in a way that doesn't expose us, where our vulnerability doesn't become a means for other people to attack us.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Well,
appreciate that, Professor Foster.
Thank you, Dr. Jason Clark.
Reverend, actually, aren't you? You're an ordained minister of religion. I should have gone
Yes,
Reverend
absolutely.
Professor. Which the Reverend always comes first, doesn't it?
Reverend comes first, I think. Yeah,
Always
Reverend Professor, and some people then put Doctor as well, but that always sounds a bit too much of a mouthful.
Reverend Professor Doctor.
Just Will.
Just Will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks, Will. And then for those people listening, I'll get links from you for all the stuff we've touched on and put in there, and some books, and put those in here. And thank you so
connect
much
on
for doing
LinkedIn.
this.
Yeah,
Great.
Connect on LinkedIn.
Put your
Contact.
LinkedIn in as well.
Yeah, be connected. That'd be
brilliant. Thank you. Well, thanks, Will. Bless you.
Thanks, Jason, and you, and hope everybody enjoyed it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.